Welcome to Maxara. Tonight's case is classified as unresolved. The following account is compiled from reported encounters, archived records, and reconstructed details. What you're about to hear is not an explanation, it's a record. This is the case of the Sodder Children Disappearance. Chapter 1: The Fire on Christmas Eve. On December 24, 1945, in a small town of Fayetteville, the Sodder family gathered for Christmas. The war had just ended months earlier. The country was exhausted but hopeful. Factories were converting back to civilian life. Soldiers were returning home. The world felt uncertain, but rebuilding. Inside their two-story frame house, George and Jennie Sodder celebrated quietly with 9 of the 10 children. One son was away serving in the military. It was an ordinary night. The children opened gifts. Some went to bed early. 5, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, asked to stay up a little longer, playing with new toys in the living room. Around 10 p.m., George, a successful local trucking contractor and outspoken Italian immigrant, turned in for the night. Jennie followed later. At 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Jennie answered. A woman's voice for someone she did not recognize. There was laughter in the background, unfamiliar, callous. When Jennie said the number was wrong, the caller hung up. She returned to bed. But something felt unsettled. Not long after, she heard a thud on the roof, something striking the house. She dismissed it. At 1 a.m., she smelled smoke. When Jennie rose again, she found flames already climbing through the lower part of the house. The fire moved quickly, unnaturally fast for a winter night. She screamed for George. The parents rushed to wake the children upstairs. The 4 older ones sleeping in their rooms. They escaped through windows. But the 5 younger children, the ones who had stayed up late, were believed to be sleeping in the upstairs bedroom near the attic. Smoke engulfed the staircase. George attempted to climb towards them. The flames forced him back. He ran outside, shouting their names. He tried to use the ladder normally kept by the house. It was gone. He attempted to start his trucks to move them beneath the windows as makeshift platforms. Neither engine would turn over. Within minutes, the house was fully consumed. Neighbors saw the blaze from a distance. The volunteer fire department did not arrive for hours. By morning, nothing remained but smoldering ash. 5 children were declared dead, but no bodies were ever recovered. In most residential fires, even severe ones, remains are discovered. Bones fragment, but they do not vanish completely. Yet when the ruins of the Sodder home were examined, no recognizable human remains were located. The fire chief, without a full excavation, concluded that the children had perished completely in the flames. The explanation was accepted quickly, too quickly. According to George and Jennie, George did not believe a house fire, even one intense, could cremate 5 bodies entirely. He began researching cremation temperatures. Professional crematoriums operate at sustained temperatures around 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours to reduce remains fully to ash. A house fire, even a destructive one, typically burns at lower, sustained temperature, and rarely long enough to eliminate all skeletal material. Yet no bones were found, no teeth, no identifiable fragments. Within days, before a thorough forensic examination could be conducted, George bulldozed the site and covered it with soil, intending to convert the area into a memorial garden. Some saw this as grief. Others later argued it destroyed potential evidence. Months later, after public pressure mounted, the site was re-examined. A small number of bone fragments were later recovered. They were sent to the Smithsonian Institution. The conclusion: the bones likely belonged to an individual aged 16 to 23. None of the missing children were that old. Further, some investigators suspected the fragments had not even been present during the initial fire, possibly introduced later. The official cause of death remained fire, but the absence of definitive remains open for a space of doubt, and doubt is difficult to extinguish. Chapter 3: The Warnings Before the Fire. The fire did not occur in isolation. In the months prior, there were signs, subtle at first. George Sodder was a local critic of Benito Mussolini. Though proud of his Italian heritage, he openly condemned fascism. In a small Appalachian town with immigrant enclaves and divided loyalties, his comments were not universally appreciated. One day, an insurance salesman visited the home. When George declined a policy, the man reportedly grew angry and warned him that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. The threat was specific. Another incident involved a stranger surveying the property, asking about the electrical wiring and fuse boxes. Weeks before Christmas, one of the children noticed a man watching the younger sibling as they walked home from school. Then came the Christmas Eve phone call and the sound of something striking the roof. Years later, investigators speculated that the object may have been a pineapple bomb, a type of hand grenade used during the war. George believed someone had thrown an incendiary device onto the roof. Additionally, the Sodders later learned that the phone line had not been burned through. It had been cut. The ladder missing from its usual position was later found discarded down an embankment. Two trucks that had functioned perfectly the day before failed simultaneously. Coincidence can explain one anomaly, perhaps two, but layered together, they form a pattern. The Sodders began to consider a possibility more terrifying than fire. What if the children had not died that night? What if they had been taken? Chapter 4: The Investigation and Its Gaps. The local volunteer fire department in Fayetteville did not arrive until nearly 8 a.m. The fire had begun shortly after 1 a.m. By the time firefighters reached the scene, the Sodder home had collapsed into a bed of ash and embers. Later, members of the department admitted that the town's phone tree alert system had failed. The fire chief, who also happened to be the local coroner, was notified, but instead of dispatching crews immediately, the message was relayed slowly from one volunteer to another. Some firefighters did not hear about the blaze until morning. In rural 1945 West Virginia, resources were limited. Equipment was basic. There were no modern arson units, no forensic preservation team. Still, the delay would prove critical. By dawn, the structure was gone. There was no former coroner's inquest, no systematic sifting of debris, no secured perimeter. Neighbors and onlookers had already walked through the site. The official explanation leaned quickly toward electrical malfunction, despite testimony that the home's wiring had recently been inspected and deemed safe. George Sodder himself maintained that the lights had remained on during the early stage of the fire, which would have been unlikely if faulty wiring had been the cause. Yet the conclusion formed rapidly. Accidental fire, 5 fatalities. The death certificates were issued within days. The cause, fire of unknown origin. The Sodders objected immediately. They requested federal involvement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation briefly reviewed correspondence related to the case. However, without clear evidence of kidnapping across state lines, federal jurisdiction was limited. The Bureau's involvement remained minimal. In time, the file was effectively closed at local level. For authorities, the case was tragic but straightforward. For the Sodders, it was unfinished. They began conducting their own investigation. They hired private investigators. They placed advertisements offering rewards. They followed leads across state lines, and reports began to surface. One woman claimed she saw 5 children matching their description looking out from a passing car on the night of the fire. A motel owner in South Carolina later said that a group of 5 children resembling the missing stayed overnight with 2 adults of Italian appearance. The adults, she said, were hostile and refused to let her speak to the children. Another tip placed them in Florida, another in Texas. None of these leads were conclusively verified, but none were definitively disproven either. And with each unconfirmed sighting, the gap between official conclusion and parental belief widened. Because once doubt is introduced into a tragedy, it changes its shape. It becomes something else. Chapter 5: The Theories. Over time, the case divided into 2 dominant narratives. The first is the official one. An accidental electrical fire erupted during the night. The flames spread rapidly through the wooden structure, fueled by old timber and winter dryness. The children, sleeping upstairs, were overcome by smoke and heat. Their remains were reduced to fragments too small or too damaged to be recognized. This theory rests on simplicity. It assumes coincidence, not conspiracy. It explains the lack of remains as a result of extreme heat. It frames the warnings, threats, and anomalies as tragic but unrelated. It offers closure. The second theory rejects that closure. It argues that the fire was staged, that the children were removed before or during the blaze, that the threats George Sodder received in the months prior were not idle remarks, but warnings. Proponents of the abduction theory point to unresolved questions. Why were the phone lines cut, reportedly found several rather than burned? Why was the ladder missing from its usual position and later discovered discarded down an embankment? Why did both of George's trucks fail to start simultaneously despite functioning properly the day before? Why were no definitive human remains identified in the initial search? Why did multiple witnesses claim to see the children alive afterward? Some suggest retaliation connected to George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini within segments of the Italian-American community. Others speculate about organized crime networks, though no documented evidence conclusively ties such groups to the case. The theory of kidnapping gained renewed attention in 1967. More than 2 decades after the fire, Jennie Sodder received a photograph in the mail. It depicted a young man in his 20s. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Little boys, A90132 or 35. Louis had been 9 years old in 1945. The resemblance to Jennie was undeniable. The family attempted to trace the photograph's origin. The envelope bore a Kentucky postmark. A private investigator was sent to follow leads, but he disappeared without reporting back. The photograph was never authenticated conclusively. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. No written address was traceable. Still, the image reinforced the Sodder's conviction that at least one child had survived. The family erected a large billboard along Route 16, featuring the faces of the 5 missing children and offering a reward for information. For years, drivers passing through West Virginia saw 5 children frozen in time. It was not just a plea, it was just a refusal to let the narrative settle. The photograph may have not been proof, but it sustained hope. A hope can outlive evidence. Chapter 6. The question that remained. George Sodder died in 1969. He maintained until the end that his children had been taken. Jennie continued searching for answers until her death in 1989. Even in old age, she reportedly wore black, not only as mourning, but as protest against certainty that she did not accept. The house is gone, the ashes long buried. The billboard eventually came down, but the questions remained disturbingly intact. If the children died in the fire, where are the remains? If the temperatures were sufficient to cremate them completely, why were household appliances and identifiable objects still recognizable in the debris? If they were taken, who orchestrated and why? Was the fire an act of vengeance that tied to political tension within immigrant communities? Or was it a targeted abduction disguised as disaster? Or was it, in fact, a tragic accident layered with coincidence that appears sinister only in hindsight? Psychologically, the case unsettles because it destabilizes closure. Fire usually leaves certainty, ash, bone fragments, a sight to mourn. The Sodder fire left absence, and absence invites imagination. In modern investigations, DNA might resolve doubt. Ground-penetrating radar might locate remains. Digital forensics might reconstruct timelines. But in 1945, evidence was not preserved. The site was disturbed. The opportunity for certainty narrowed quickly. Time has eroded testimony. Memories faded. Witnesses died. What survives are contradictions. And the image of 5 children who may have died in their beds, or may have grown into adults somewhere under different names, unaware that a billboard once carried their faces across rural highways. The most unsettling possibility is not organized crime, nor elaborate conspiracy. It is that truth was lost early, in haste, in assumption, in the failure to treat a catastrophe as potentially something more. Because once George Sodder bulldozed the remains of his home, perhaps out of grief, perhaps out of frustration, the physical chance to revisit that ground disappeared. 5 children were declared dead. No bodies were conclusively proven. A mother waited for confirmation that never came. A father believed until his last breath that someone, somewhere, knew more than they admitted. And somewhere between flame and ash, the line between tragedy and mystery blurred permanently. The Sodder children were either lost to fire or to history, and we still do not know which. End of case.